You must understand something that most people never stop long enough to see, something so woven into the fabric of our daily lives that it becomes invisible until suddenly it isn't. The quiet machinery of American banking does not roar. It does not march. It does not storm the streets. It whispers. It hums behind the walls. It expands in stillness. And because it does not declare itself openly, people confuse its silence for safety. They mistake the absence of noise for the presence of security. But silence in systems of power is often the most dangerous sound of all. It is the sound before a collapse. It is the sound before a storm tears through a nation already weakened by exhaustion and fear. And if you listen closely, really listen, you can feel that hum shaping you, shaping your decisions, shaping the life you believe you freely chose. Most Americans never notice. They wake up, swipe the card, check the balance, pay the bill, renew the credit line, and quietly surrender another piece of themselves, believing they are managing their lives when, in truth, their lives are being managed for them. The calm they trust is not calm. It is sedation. It is the deep, heavy quietness that settles before a crisis announces itself. We live in a country where the architecture of control is built not with armies, not with chains, not with visible weapons, but with contracts, numbers, promises, and threats that never need to be spoken aloud. The banks do not need to shout because their power is so complete it has become normal. And that is the most terrifying form of power, the kind that becomes ordinary. The kind that slips into the bloodstream of a society until people believe they were born with it, destined to obey it, unable to imagine a world outside it. And yet, there comes a moment, often in the quiet of a night, when the weight of unpaid bills presses like a hand on the chest, when an American begins to feel the truth. A tightening, a pressure, a sense that something is wrong, deeply wrong, profoundly wrong. They feel controlled, but they cannot quite name the force. They feel used, but they cannot locate the hand. They feel watched, measured, evaluated, but they cannot see the eyes. That is the brilliance of this machinery. Its greatest strength is that it remains unseen. You are conditioned not to question it. You are conditioned to trust it, revere it, rely on it even as it extracts the marrow of your hope. You walk into its walls willingly. You sign your name with trembling loyalty, and you cling to the illusion that you are making a choice. But let me tell you, the system does not fear your choices. It fears your awareness. It fears the moment you stop treating this silence as harmless. It fears the moment you recognize that the stability you have been promised is not stability at all, but a fragile illusion held together by the debt of millions who believe they have no alternative. And that illusion, oh, how powerful it is. It comforts you even as it confines you. It tells you that as long as the bills are paid, as long as the interest is manageable, as long as the credit score glows like some holy number, you are safe, you are responsible, you are good. But those numbers do not measure goodness. They measure obedience. They measure compliance. They measure how effectively you have surrendered your life to a structure that feeds on your labor, your time, your fear, and your silence. And I stand here telling you this not because I want to frighten you, but because fear has already claimed too much from you. I tell you because awakening begins with truth, and truth is rarely gentle. Truth does not comfort. Truth disrupts. Truth rattles the bones. Truth forces you to see the storm gathering at the edge of your ordinary life. Look around you. Look at a country where the average person carries more debt than savings. Look at a society where the young enter adulthood already financially crippled, where families measure their future not in dreams but in payments, where retirement is postponed not by choice but by necessity. This is not stability. This is not safety. This is captivity dressed in calmness. And deep within you, whether you admit it or not, you feel the tremor, you feel the quiet before the reckoning. You feel the unsettling truth that the machinery controlling your life has always been there, expanding in silence, shaping your destiny while you slept. But awakening begins when you stop mistaking silence for peace, when you stop believing calmness means control. When you understand that systems built in the shadows can only be confronted once you dare to step into the light and name them for what they are, this is not the end. This is the beginning of seeing, when you begin to see that this quiet machinery is not merely operating around you, but burrowing into the very architecture of your life. You also begin to recognize how generations have been shaped not by the dreams they carried, but by the weight they never chose. Debt in America is not a transaction. It is a legacy. It is inherited like a wound, passed from parent to child the way trauma moves silently through blood. And it tightens year after year, a rope that loops not around the body but around the soul, drawing it closer to a kind of spiritual suffocation that too many mistake for adulthood. Think of the young stepping into this world, hopeful, eager, frightened, believing, because they have been told since childhood that opportunity waits for them if they just work hard enough, stay disciplined, stay focused, stay obedient. But the moment they reach for education, for a home, for stability, they are met with contracts that whisper promises while concealing shackles. And before they even understand the language of interest or the cruelty of compounding, the rope is already cinched. The first tug is gentle, the next one is firmer. And over time, the tightening becomes a rhythm so familiar they no longer question it. Debt becomes a companion, a shadow, a presence that follows them into their sleep, into their relationships, into every decision they dare to make. It shapes what they believe they deserve. It tells them when to take risks and when to retreat. It scolds them when they dream too boldly. It mocks them when they imagine a life beyond survival. And step by step, this burden, this invisible noose, turns freedom into something purchased rather than lived, something rationed rather than embraced. And you must understand, the genius of this system is that it convinces people that this weight is normal. It persuades them that suffering is simply the cost of participation. It whispers the lie that being crushed beneath obligations is proof of responsibility, proof of maturity, proof of moral character. But there is nothing moral about a society that conditions its citizens to spend their lives digging out of holes they never dug. There is nothing ethical in a structure that tells its people that bondage is the pathway to dignity. Look around at the faces of those you know, your family, your neighbors, the coworkers who drag themselves through each day with hollow eyes. Look at their fatigue. It is not simply physical exhaustion. It is the exhaustion of souls forced to carry more weight than human beings were ever designed to bear. It is the awareness of dreams deferred again and again until they no longer know whether they abandoned their dreams or their dreams abandoned them. And yet, even in this crushing landscape, people still cling to the illusion that they are free because they can choose which burden to shoulder next. They believe they have agency because they can select the color of the chain. They convince themselves that if they can just endure a little more, sacrifice a little more, postpone joy a little longer, one day the rope will loosen and they will finally breathe. But the rope does not loosen. It tightens, slowly, quietly, consistently. And the tightening becomes so expected, so familiar, that generations stop questioning why they are strangling in the first place. They inherit debt not as a crisis, but as a condition of existence. They internalize it the way previous generations internalized famine, war, or disease, not as a failure of the system, but as an unavoidable fact of life. And here is the devastating truth we rarely speak aloud. Many Americans have never once experienced a single day of life unshadowed by financial fear. Think about that. Think about the psychic violence of a nation where even children feel the corners of fear pressing inward because they watch their parents tremble at bills laid on the kitchen table. Think about how early the rope is felt, how early the tightening begins, how early a child learns that dreams are fragile things, easily bruised by numbers they cannot yet understand. This is not freedom, this is not prosperity, this is generational captivity disguised as opportunity. And yet, the people carrying these burdens still walk with remarkable dignity. They still hope, they still rise. They still believe that something better must exist beyond the horizon of their struggle. That belief, fragile, trembling, persistent, is perhaps the last rebellion the system has not fully extinguished. And that is why I stand here telling you this with urgency in my voice and fire in my chest. Because until we confront the truth of the rope, until we name it, expose it, refuse it, we will continue mistaking bondage for responsibility and exhaustion for citizenship. We will continue passing the rope down to our children, tightening it around their futures, long before they understand freedom was ever meant to be their birthright. But the moment we see the rope for what it is, the moment the generations awaken, the tightening begins to tremble. because the moment the tightening begins to tremble, you also begin to see with stark clarity how the illusions of prosperity have been crafted and perfected, how they rise before you like monuments built from smoke, shimmering with promise while concealing a deeper rot. You see how the credit score becomes a kind of secular holiness, a number that pretends to measure responsibility, but in truth measures submission. You see how loan approvals are offered like blessings, not because you are valued, but because your labor, your fear, your compliance can still be harvested. You see how rising credit limits masquerade as opportunity, even as they dig the pit deeper beneath your feet. These are not gifts. They are bait. They are traps disguised as triumphs. And you must understand the magnitude of this deception. These illusions are not accidents. They are sacraments of a modern faith. A faith built not on hope or justice or community, but on the relentless worship of survival. Ordinary people, good people, hardworking people are turned into parishioners of a system that demands more devotion the more it takes from them. The rituals are familiar. The paperwork, the signatures, the endless confirmations of identity and worthiness, the whispered relief when an application is approved, as though a divine hand has granted mercy. But there is no mercy in this. There is only indulgence carefully calibrated to keep you believing that the institution is benevolent, that the institution cares, that the institution is helping you ascend. Yet behind every approval lies the quiet arithmetic of exploitation. Behind every increase lies the expectation that you will work harder, longer, deeper into your own fatigue to sustain the illusion they have sold you. And the danger of this illusion is that it feels like progress. It feels like achievement. It feels like the path every responsible adult must walk. But what is responsibility when defined by a structure that needs you indebted? What is achievement when measured by numbers created to monitor obedience? What is adulthood when the milestones are built on the promise of what you will owe? It is a cruel brilliance, this system, because it does not simply demand your compliance, it shapes your identity around it. It convinces you that your worth is tethered to your credit score, that your potential is bound to the size of your loan, that your respectability is tied to how well you perform the rituals of repayment. And soon you find yourself praying, not to a God, not to a higher calling, but to the balance in your checking account, to the approval of an algorithm, to the faint hope that the next email from the bank is not another tightening of the rope. And in this state, something in you begins to fracture. You feel it. The splitting. The quiet breaking. Because human beings were not designed to worship numbers. They were not created to measure their existence through interest rates and statements. They were not born to kneel before institutions that refuse to confess their own sins. And yet here we are, living in a country where millions have learned to bow their heads before these financial altars, seeking redemption through payments that never end. But listen, there comes a moment, painful and sharp, when the veneer of prosperity cracks. When the illusions you once clung to begin to dissolve under the weight of your lived experience. A moment when the approval that once felt like validation suddenly reveals itself as manipulation. When the rising limits that once felt like freedom expose themselves as deeper chains. When the system that once felt like a partner shows its true face as a warden. And in that moment, something inside you awakens. Not fully, not entirely, but enough to sense the lie. Enough to feel the tremor beneath the polished surface. Enough to understand that the prosperity you were promised was never prosperity at all, but a carefully managed illusion designed to keep you striving, sacrificing, surrendering inch by inch the very essence of who you are. And that realization, aching, heavy, undeniable, marks the beginning of a new kind of awareness. A harsh light enters the room, a painful clarity. You begin to see the architecture of control hidden in the rituals you once performed without question. You begin to recognize that the system itself is incapable of compassion, that it thrives not when you succeed, but when you struggle, that it is nourished by your fear, your shame, your longing to be seen as worthy. And once this truth settles into your bones, once you allow yourself to acknowledge the fragility of the illusion, the spell begins to weaken, the shackles loosen, not enough to escape, not yet, but enough to shift. Enough to breathe, enough to see that the altar before which you have knelt for years was never sacred. It was a stage built to keep you enthralled, obedient, and dreaming of a freedom that was always meant to remain just out of reach, and as that false altar begins to dim, as its glow fades and the air around it cools, you start to notice something else, something heavier, darker, ominously familiar. You begin to see how the system does not merely deceive, it exhausts. It drains the life force from people slowly, methodically, until they are too tired to lift their heads, too burdened to raise a question, too overwhelmed to even imagine resistance. This exhaustion is not an accident, it is not a byproduct, it is the design. Because a wary nation is a compliant one. A nation drowning in obligations has no breath left to speak truth. A nation crushed beneath the weight of its own survival will not pause long enough to see who is standing on its neck. Look around you at the rhythm of American life. The rushing, the hustling, the constant scrambling for stability that always seems to slip a little further away the harder people chase it. You see parents working 2 or 3 jobs not to live, but simply to keep from sinking. You see young adults sacrificing their youth on the altar of repayment. You see the elderly re-entering the workforce because retirement has become a luxury, not a right. And beneath all of this movement, this frantic pushing, this desperate clinging, there is a silence, a deep, suffocating silence, because no one has the energy left to ask why a country so rich demands so much suffering from its own people. And that is the tragedy. Exhaustion becomes the norm. Fatigue becomes the culture. Weariness becomes the oxygen people breathe. They tell themselves it's temporary. They tell themselves it's necessary. They tell themselves everyone else is enduring the same pressure, so it must be acceptable. But acceptance of injustice is often born from exhaustion, not agreement. People stop questioning because questioning takes energy. It takes clarity. It takes the mental and emotional strength that the system has already stripped from them. And you see it in their eyes. The hollow stare, the forced smile, the quiet defeat hiding behind polite conversations. You see people who once burned with possibility, now shrinking beneath the weight of obligations they never had a chance to escape. You see souls numbed, not by apathy, but by survival. Because when every day feels like a battlefield, you learn to stop noticing the war. This is how control sustains itself, not through force, not through violence, but through exhaustion. Through the slow erosion of the human spirit, through the relentless demands that keep people so preoccupied with staying afloat that they never question who stirred the waters to begin with. And yet the cruelty deepens, because the system convinces these same exhausted people that their struggle is their own fault, that if they are drowning, it is because they lack discipline. That if they are overwhelmed, it is a failure of planning. That if they are tired, it is because they didn't work hard enough. And the people believe it. They fold into themselves with shame, carrying the weight of their struggle as though it were a personal flaw rather than the result of an engineered reality. This shame becomes another chain. Another silence, another surrender, and with each surrender, the architecture tightens, the grip strengthens. The system grows bolder. But I want you to see something painful, something most refuse to acknowledge. This exhaustion is not individual. It is collective. It moves like a fog across the nation, settling into homes, workplaces, marriages, friendships. It disconnects people from one another, because when everyone is fighting to survive, no one has the strength to hold the hand of another. The community dissolves. Solidarity fractures. People retreat into their own private struggles, unaware that millions are collapsing under the same weight. And this fragmentation, this isolation, is the final weapon, because exhausted individuals do not revolt. Overwhelmed individuals do not organize. Spiritually starved individuals do not dare to imagine a different future. They simply endure. They simply obey. They simply drift through their days like sleepwalkers shuffling toward a cliff they cannot see. But somewhere, deep in the marrow of this exhaustion, a whisper still exists. A faint question, a quiet rebellion, a trembling awareness that things are not as they should be. And that whisper, though small, is dangerous, because once a person hears it, truly hears it, the illusion of normalcy begins to unravel, and the quiet machinery of control trembles at the thought of what an awakened, no longer wary people might become, because the moment that whisper dares to rise even faintly, it collides with something far more insidious, a numbness that creeps into the spirit when people believe they have no power left. And this numbness is not apathy, It is despair wearing the mask of acceptance. It is the quiet surrender that grows when the system convinces you that the walls around you are permanent, that the ceiling above you is immovable, that the future before you is already written in ink you did not choose. When banks feel like gods, distant, unchallengeable, omnipresent, people begin to shrink. They begin to lose the language of hope. They begin to forget the shape of their own strength. You feel this numbness in the stillness of late nights, when you sit alone with the heaviness of bills and obligations that seem to multiply faster than your ability to meet them. You feel it in the way your chest tightens at the thought of the future, as though the road ahead is not a path, but a tunnel narrowing around you. You feel it in the unsettling sense that no matter how hard you work, how carefully you plan, how much you sacrifice, the system remains indifferent, unmoved, untouched by the enormity of your struggle, and something inside you begins to harden, a protective shell, a spiritual callus. You stop dreaming because dreams feel dangerous. You stop hoping because hope feels costly. You stop imagining alternatives because alternatives feel like fantasies reserved for people who were born into softer worlds. And in this quiet collapse of the inner self, the system finds its greatest victory, not in your poverty, not in your debt, but in the erosion of your belief that you were ever meant for anything more. This is how spiritual numbness spreads. Not through a single moment of defeat, but through 1,000 small moments of resignation. Through the draining repetition of trying and failing, through the slow grind of obligations that never loosen their grip, through the constant message embedded in every transaction, you are not in control. You never were, and when a population internalizes that message, when it settles deep into the psyche, it becomes a nation of people who move through their lives with their eyes lowered, their voices softened, their courage buried beneath layers of learned helplessness. It becomes a country where people speak about the future not with anticipation, but with dread. Where children grow up watching their parents crumble under pressures that should never have been normalized. Where adults carry an unspoken fear that life is nothing more than a series of financial tests designed to expose their inadequacies. This fear, unseen but persistent, becomes a courtroom in the mind. Each day feels like a trial. Each decision feels like evidence of guilt. And the prosecutor is the system itself, pointing to missed payments, to growing balances, to rising interest, to shrinking savings, as though they are moral failures rather than symptoms of an environment engineered to create dependence. You stand accused without ever knowing the charges. You carry a sentence without ever having committed a crime. And this psychological violence, this spiritual suffocation, is what keeps millions locked in place. Not because they lack intelligence, not because they lack ambition, but because they have been conditioned to believe that resistance is futile, that change is impossible, that the machine is too vast, too entrenched, too sacred to challenge. They numb themselves because feeling fully would require confronting a truth too heavy to bear alone. But there is something else, something fragile yet potent, beneath that numbness, a pulse, a flicker, the final ember of a spirit that refuses to die. It may be buried beneath years of struggle. It may be dimmed by disappointment. It may tremble beneath the weight of unspoken fears. But it is there, waiting, yearning, straining for air, and when you allow yourself to sense it, even for a moment, when you let it rise from beneath the numbness, you begin to realize that this ember is not a weakness. It is a warning. A signal that your soul has not been fully captured. A reminder that even in your most exhausted state, something within you still knows the truth, that the system's greatest power was never its wealth, but its ability to convince you that you had none of your own. And once that realization begins to take shape within you, the numbness trembles, it cracks, it weakens. And through that fracture, something long silenced begins to stir. A quiet but undeniable sense that surrender was never your destiny, and that reclaiming your life begins with the courage to feel again. Because once that courage begins to rise, even as a trembling breath, it pushes you toward a truth the system fears more than anything, the awakening that does not erupt in violence or spectacle, but in the steady reclaiming of your own sight, a clarity that pierces the illusions you once bowed before. A realization that the forces shaping your life are not divine, not inevitable, not eternal, but manufactured, curated, constructed by institutions that rely on your blindness to sustain their dominion. And when that clarity ignites, even faintly, it changes everything. Because you cannot unsee what you have finally dared to face. You begin to understand that power in this country does not operate through transparency, but through concealment. Through complexity designed to confuse, through language designed to obscure, through structures designed to make you believe you are the one who failed rather than the one being exploited. You begin to see how the banking system thrives on opacity, how it hides behind terms you were never meant to fully grasp, behind contracts that stretch like labyrinths, behind interest rates that shift like shadows, behind decisions made in boardrooms far removed from the lives they devastate. And with this new vision, you realize the depth of the deception. The system did not simply take your money, it took your understanding. It convinced you the world was too complicated to question. It told you that the mechanisms of power were beyond your reach. It pushed you into a perpetual fog where uncertainty became your prison and confusion became your chains. But in the moment the fog begins to thin, in the moment comprehension flickers through the haze, the machinery loses its greatest weapon. Because the truth is this: the system relies on your disorientation. It relies on you being too overwhelmed to decipher its motives, too intimidated to challenge its structures, too mistrustful of your own perception to believe the manipulation you feel in your bones. But once you begin to see the architecture clearly, once you trace the lines of power back to their origins, you understand that these institutions are not guardians but predators. They survive not by protecting the vulnerable but by devouring them. And that clarity comes with a cost, because it forces you to confront the magnitude of what has been taken from you, the years lost in silent struggle, the dreams surrendered to fear, the belief in your own capability eroded until it felt like dust slipping through your fingers. You feel the grief of it, a grief so heavy it presses against the ribs, a grief so deep it shakes the ground beneath your feet. But grief is often the doorway to awakening, because grief is what rises when illusions die. And as those illusions fall, one by one, something long buried begins to surface, something fierce, something luminous, something profoundly human. A strength that does not roar but insists, a strength that emerges not from defiance alone, but from recognition of your own worth, recognition of your own intelligence, recognition of your own right to question, to challenge, to reclaim what was taken from you. This awakening is not loud, it does not rush, it unfolds slowly, like dawn breaking after a night that felt endless. You start to see how your exhaustion was manufactured, how your numbness was cultivated, how your doubt was engineered. You see how the banking system feeds on insecurity, how it thrives when people believe they are incapable of understanding their own oppression. And with this seeing comes another revelation: the system is powerful, yes, but it is not invincible. It is vast, yes, but it is not sacred. It is entrenched, yes, but it is not immune to collapse, especially when the people it relies on begin to recognize the architecture of control for what it truly is. And as this recognition grows, as it spreads like a quiet wildfire across minds once clouded by fear, a new kind of resolve begins to take shape. A resolve not born of rage but of clarity, not of recklessness but of purpose. A resolve rooted in the simple, unshakable truth that no system built on deception can survive a people who finally see clearly. Because seeing is the first act of liberation. Understanding is the first breach in the walls. Awareness is the first blow struck against the machinery that has fed on your silence for far too long. And in that clarity, still fragile, still forming, you feel something the system hoped you would never feel again: the faint but undeniable sense that your life belongs to you, that your future is not predetermined, that your worth is not measured in digits or debt. And this realization, small as it may seem, is the spark that threatens to set the entire illusion ablaze.